I'm going to start my conversation up here on the stage tonight by bringing Joseph Williams up. Joseph is a native Tennessean. He's an attorney. Actually, both of these guys are attorneys, so don't let that scare you. He's an attorney, and he is a founding partner of the Peacefield Group. That is a legal and policy consulting firm in Nashville. Prior to founding Peacefield, he practiced law at the American Center for Law and Justice. You know them as the ACLJ, advising prominent national and international clients. His practice has focused on constitutional law and government accountability. He also writes extensively on issues of educational equity and the dignity and rights of people with developmental disabilities. And so, Joseph Williams, thank you for joining us tonight at the Storytellers Museum.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So you know that I am proposing that what we need is a distinctively Christian witness in terms of public moral leadership and even in the political sphere. What would that look like?
So I was struck by the last words you read from the book, which said you were talking about across every demographic, every race, every tribe, creed, your traditional ways of categorizing people. But the last thing you said was across every dividing line. And we live in an environment in which there are people on both sides of the political aisle, inside the church and outside of the church. I'm getting real right from the start, but inside the church and outside of the church, who have created their platforms and have gained power and influence and positions to be pundits and things, not coming from a distinctively Christian place, but because they realize they have an opportunity to gain more influence by pitting this group against this group on this issue.
If I can let me just tell you that in my own experience, if you can make evangelicals mad, you can get them to give.
Correct. Right. So, undoubtedly true.
But that means
not just evangelicals.
But I'm just saying
that's just a human instinct.
Well, I'm just saying that in terms of my experience, right?
Yeah.
So in my experience, and in order to do that, you've got to at least set up at least a straw man, if not a real
correct
substantive enemy. So what's the first step in getting to the place where we don't line up as red and blue, whatever that means, but we actually line up with each other as Christ followers?
Right, correct. So one is, I'll touch on the straw man piece first. There was an interview that didn't get much traction. It was in World Magazine. It was last year sometime. It was with Senator Ben Sass from Nebraska. And he
spilled a Dr. Pepper on somebody today.
He did, yeah. He spilled a Dr. Pepper on Ted Cruz during a very intense questioning of a Senate hearing. But in this interview, Senator Sass said something that has stuck with me and that I revisit like once a month when I'm talking to people and having conversations like this. And he said, Christians need to realize that we need to follow the 9th commandment when we're having political debates and involved in political discourse. He said, we can't bear false witness against our neighbor. And when we argue against straw men, we're doing that. When we are propping up and pretending that who we're arguing against has a very weak position, we're doing that. When we're not articulating the best version of our opponent's arguments, we're bearing false witness. And we're making discourse worse. And we're weakening our own arguments and our own position. And so I think that's step one, is you need to understand your opponent's argument. And part of that is, a distinctive part of that is something else from Scripture, and that is a recognition that when we're arguing with our political opponents or people that we disagree with on a cultural issue or political issue, we are arguing with people who need the cross of Jesus Christ just as much as we do. And it's almost a more powerful statement when you invert that. Mm-hmm. We need the cross of Jesus Christ just as much as whoever we're arguing with, no matter what the issue is. And that kind of Philippians 2, Christ-like humility, changes the game if you then allow that to be the foundation from which you continue the dialogue and discourse.
I think one of the challenges that I see people confronting, they find themselves drawn into useless controversies, right?
Right.
They find themselves drawn into a conversation that they've been seduced into having, right? And somebody has created a no-win environment. So give us permission to not enter every conversation or to reframe the conversation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, it will surprise people, and it often does, if you make arguments bringing people together instead of splitting people apart. So if it's a controversy in which you acknowledge that perhaps there is some self-justification on both sides that a lot of people could agree with, but those in power who are pitting people against one another are trying to prop up these straw men on both sides. And so I think when doing that, there was a lunch a couple weeks ago, and I think you're going to mention it later. Governor Haslam did an interview with Dr. Russell Moore, and he was talking about some opportunities for the churches in this very toxic environment, talking about racial reconciliation, criminal justice, some things that there is a lot of divisiveness happening, and there are people who are propping up themselves and their organizations of this idea of creating a no-win situation in which there will always be fighting, and there will always be virtue signaling, and there will always be tribalism in which you run to your corners and you throw bombs at the other side, instead of maybe sitting down and having a conversation. And this was what Governor Haslam said. He said, if churches can't be the place where we can get people of goodwill from every perspective on controversial issues to educate each other, inform each other, and persuade one another, then where can we? And we live in a time in which that's not happening, but that's a huge, significant opportunity for churches.
So let's talk about a specific issue that I know you're passionate about, and that would be education. Education is pretty inequitable in our country right now. And it doesn't really matter where you live, and yet it matters a whole lot where you live, the quality of the education that you get. So talk with us about education, and talk with us about some possibilities for educational reform.
And how Christians can engage this issue.
Absolutely.
Because this is if you want to talk about divisive topics within evangelical Christian communities, bring up the issue of education, public versus private, homeschooling, classical Christian models, everything in between. You're going to open up a can of worms, often within families and within congregations. So it doesn't be. That's another example of it's not an either or. It can be a both and, to steal from the next speaker's organization that he founded and is going to talk about. It doesn't have to be like, you can look at your children and look at every single individual child and say, what is the best educational environment for them? Because it may be different between the kids in your own family.
Absolutely.
Much less, scaled out. But if I decide to send my kid to a private school or to homeschool them, that doesn't mean that you then can't be involved and join the board of a charter school or run for school board for public schools. Like, society tries to tell you have to choose, but you can serve the least of these regardless. Or maybe you can do like some of my friends have done and found private charter Christian classical schools, which are built into their business model, diversity, in which a group of families decide this is important and we're going to subsidize this, and donors subsidize it, but then there are also scholarships given so that there is actual equity built into the model of this school.
Yeah, because it's not just that we want our kids to have access to the best education. We actually want all kids to have access to the best education. And I think that, as a person who went to public school, graduated from, public school, I was really blessed. But I know that I was blessed because of where I lived in the city that I lived in. And so I think that when we talk about, when Christians engage in this particular conversation, we know that education matters. And we know that who is teaching our kids matters, and certainly what our kids are being taught matters. So help us have a passion for that to be true for every kid,
Right.
and not just for our kids.
Right. So Christians need to realize, especially Christians of means and Christians of privilege, they need to realize that educational choice is something they may have because of where they were born, the amount of money they have. But educational choice, unfortunately, is not a reality for everyone. And Christians should be caring about the welfare of the entire community. That's, a basic commandment from God. And one way to do this, and to reconnect it to how we talk about these issues as well, is whenever we talk, whether it's education or another policy issue, we often like to talk about it as like, well, this is a problem we need to solve. This is an issue that needs to be tackled, and I don't know how to step onto it. One easy step that anyone can make is to realize that policy and political issues are at their core always about people first. And let me give you an example of that.
Wait a second. I talk about that in the book. I just want to say, the issue is not what you think it is, right?
Right.
So we want to deal with people, not issues. So
Right.
every time that
Yes.
we start talking about an issue, thank you
Yeah.
for acknowledging, we're talking about people. We're talking about the real things that real people deal with every day.
Right.
So thank you for
And
pointing that out.
And as Christians, we should realize more so than anyone else that we're broken and that we're sinful, and therefore we have a limited perspective. And so we don't understand where everyone else is coming from. And so we need to just have conversations with them to learn about where they're coming from before entering into a debate or a discourse. And an example of that I've been talking with people over the last few weeks about various education reform initiatives in Tennessee and things that have been successful, things that haven't. And a story I keep telling is a few weeks ago we were coming back from DC, and it was late, and it was like 11:30 at night, and our Uber driver home was an Iraqi gentleman who's lived in Nashville for about 25 years and came over here as a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old. He's driving Uber at 11:30 at night on a weekday while his kids are at home working on homework and hopefully getting in bed at a decent hour. But he was talking to us, and he didn't know education was a passion of mine. He didn't know I was the chairman of the board of charter school, or I taught high school for 2 years. But he was just saying that for his 10-year-old and 15-year-old, they had very bad experiences in public schools. Mm-hmm. It was not a place where they were thriving or succeeding or getting a chance at living the type of life and having the type of opportunity that he moved to Nashville for 25 years ago from Iraq. But luckily, he got them into 2 different charter schools. And they were thriving, and they were succeeding, and they were finally loving school and loving life and living up to their potential, and because they were finally given the opportunity. So that gets to it again. This isn't about policies. We can debate charter school funding and education funding and revenues and costs and teachers unions and pieces of legislation, but these are real people. These are real lives at stake here. And I think always getting to the root of that, regardless of what you're debating or who you're debating with, begins to build a bridge that you can then have a more productive conversation from.
So one final question in this part of the conversation, and we're distributing note cards for you to, if you come up with questions that you have, we're going to jot those down. We're going to pick them up during the little break in between conversation partners. You're not really speakers. So if you've got something in mind that you're like, oh, I want to be sure I get to ask that, go ahead and jot that down. Joseph, most people think that the government is something other than us.
Right.
All right. But we the people is what that's
right.
How this is supposed to work. So, just give us your elevator pitch, your elevator speech on what government is and how it's supposed to function.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And needed right now, right?
It's not functioning. Let me just.
It is not functioning.
In case you don't know,
yeah, spoiler alert.
It's not working right now very well for most people. Yeah.
Government should be responding to the people's needs so that they can live lives of human flourishing freely. That would be...
Define human flourishing for folks in the room for whom that's a new way of thinking.
Right. So human flourishing is, I'll get back to that. I'm going to take a convoluted road to that definition. We often hear debates and think of government debates about small government versus big government. Oh, the government's doing a lot. Or, oh, the government's not doing very little. Get it out of my life. And a phrase that is often missed, but some politicians and policy nerds like me will bring it back up, is limited government. And that limited government is different from small government. Sometimes they're similar, but limited government is the idea of the government should be doing what it's supposed to do, which is protecting the God-given rights of individuals and creating a structure in which the people can govern themselves with their representatives and have the hardcore debates about things that matter, which can range from, is there a heaven and a hell, to what should our tax rates be and how are we going to fund education and what are we going to mandate, right? But limited government is this idea of the government shouldn't be getting involved in every single part of your life, but its job is to make sure that the human dignity, the imago Dei, regardless of what your beliefs are, but like the dignity of every single human being should be protected fundamentally. So and so that would be the difference between limited government and small government, for example. Like there were those during the civil rights era that claimed the mantle of small government, keep the federal government out of my schools so that they could continue discriminating. But limited government said, no, actually there is a role for the federal government here because the human dignity of our brothers and sisters in Christ and our fellow Americans is being trampled upon and trounced upon right now. And so in this debate, that's often missed. And these are philosophical things, but then again, when it gets down to people and it gets down to, are these people being treated the same? And this isn't from some distant time, this is happening today. There are individuals in our midst, immigrants, refugees, victims of police brutality, people of color, unborn children, who are not given equal dignity under the law. I just said something that probably makes people uncomfortable regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. That's what Jesus did when he was on earth, right? Mm-hmm. Is he made everyone uncomfortable and made everyone realize they need a cross and they have work to do to serve the least of these. Christians need to be doing that.
All right, well, I'll ask you my next question when we all three get back up together. But let's give Joseph a hand for his willingness to engage in these conversations.
Thank you. Thank you.